Welcome back, episode 4 of No Shit. I'm your host, Matt Frazier. Today, Friday, October 27th, year of our Lord 2017. My guest, the creator of worlds, god of dragons, purveyor of odd wisdoms, the mad historian himself, my friend Eric Smith. How you doing tonight, Eric?
Good. How are you, man?
So, I'm good, thank you. So I asked Eric after he joined me, I think we were on the last podcast, I asked Eric if he had any really interesting topics that he thought we could cover on the podcast, and he almost immediately came up with his subject material for this evening and has brought reference material. So I guess... Is this also going to qualify as some sort of college credit in the future?
Yeah. Not yet.
So tonight we're going to be talking. I'm going to let Eric explain to you what tonight's subject's going to be about, because I think I would murder it, and I'm getting to kind of hear all of this for the first time myself. So please go ahead.
We are going to discuss psychotropic influences on religions and proto-religions in particular. Maybe setting a frame of reference and taking you or people back to these proto-religions and what I'm talking about when I say that, and then discussing how those proto-religions were influenced by a couple of factors, one main one of which would be psychotropic substances.
So proto-religion, I'm an idiot. What's proto-religion mean?
Proto-religion is the religions that existed before established religions that we know of, established ancient religions. So, when you're talking about the Egyptian religion, the ancient Egyptian gods and religion, we're talking about the religion that preceded that, or the type of religions that preceded those religions. Or if you're talking about the Sumerian mythology and religion, you're talking about a religion that preceded that we don't really know about, that gave rise to that religion that we do know about.
Okay, we covered kind of that there's common themes that pull through all of the world's major religions even today, right? We covered that in the previous podcast, right?
Yeah.
So is your premise that at some point in time that there is a theory that psychotropic drugs has had some sort of influence on man's interpretation of God, right? Is that kind of what you're getting at, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. There, specifically, I'm talking about, if you want to read more about the subject, a book called Inside the Neolithic Mind by David Lewis Williams and David Pierce. And what they're talking about is, first let me set a frame of reference for you. Starting with Christianity, you ask what is religion, for instance, and you can say, well, Christian religion goes back to ancient times. Like when I was a kid, I thought that was ancient times, when you're talking about the time of Christ and stuff, and as I started to learn more about history, I realized that there was this huge amount of history before that, and then realized there's this prehistory before that. So to take it back in reference, starting with Christianity, most people understand and realize and would say it is true that Christianity was spawned from Judaism. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think even the Bible says that, right?
Sure, yeah. It's pretty well established.
Right.
And I think that even though it's a lesser known fact that most people realize that the Judaic religion stems from the Zoroastrianism religion, the Persian religion. And so before that, before there were city-states, we're talking about the Neolithic period. So we're talking about Neanderthals that lived in hunting-gathering societies and roamed around and never settled down and had no idea of agriculture. So we're talking about the type of religion that these guys would be practicing.
So like tribal religion.
Yeah.
Okay. And there's examples of tribal religion in North America, obviously.
Yeah, North America and France and the Levant and a lot of places.
Okay.
From the northern to the southern hemisphere. So we're talking about that long ago, before written history. And we talked about Göbekli Tepe, which is a lot of people have heard a lot of recent things about. One of the main things that they talk about when they talk about Göbekli Tepe is how it's rewriting history books, because it dates back to something around 12,000 years ago. Like potentially back to 12,000 years ago. Now cities, the first cities that ever existed, date back to around 5,000 BC, which is about 6,000 years ago.
Okay.
Right? So that's the earliest evidence we found of cities, like people organizing in cities. So when they look at Göbekli Tepe, what they see is people organizing not because of cities, but because of religion, right? So, and the religion is unidentifiable. It's not specifically the Sumerian religion. It predates the Sumerian religion, which it predates the Egyptian religion. And those are two of the earliest religions that we know of, that we can trace back into antiquity.
Okay.
Right? So it's an unspecified religion. We really don't know what it is. So we call it tribal, right? But it's not so much tribal in the sense that these people came and organized themselves and built these structure. There was, let's see, specifically more than 200 pillars in almost 20 circles currently known through geographical survey. Each pillar has a height of up to 20 feet and weighs up to 20 tons. So you're talking about like 12,000 years ago, and people are organizing themselves to the point where they're able to build these kind of structure. It'd be hard to get people here in our home city to be organized to do anything like that without just killing people, like,
right.
Oh, stones falling on people,
yeah,
just
right.
people just, So it was thought that the first signs of man making cities and living together came about because of the agrarian revolution. Right, where people had learned how to sow crops, and so they're hanging out in one spot, and cities are being formed. They've got to guard stuff, right? But here you're seeing signs, and this is not the only structure like this. This is just the one that's currently in the news. But you're seeing signs of people organizing far, far earlier than that by thousands of years, before even written language, right? So none of this, of whatever they were doing, is written down.
Yeah, that's one of the things that sticks out in my mind that I've heard about Göbekli Tepe is that it predates agriculture.
It does. Yeah, it does. There are other structures that also do. One of the more famous ones is Jericho. That city dates to about 10,000 BC, which is before the agrarian revolution.
Like the biblical Jericho, like Joshua. Okay.
There's also, and I don't know if I'm going to say these right, but there's, any Spanish?
Not enough to murder that.
Yeah.
Gaia Nikides.
It's a cave in Mexico, in places that we can't pronounce.
Oaxaca, Mexico, it looks like. Begins with an O.
It's the earliest known location for domestication of any crop on the continent. Like the first place where they can show that people were starting to stay in one place and raise and cultivate with horticulture, as opposed to agriculture, crops. And there's also Nevli Kari in Turkey, Tel Kormel. There's also a Greek cave, another name I'm going to butcher, Francheti, and another one that I can't even begin to pronounce.
There's one in France, too, that the National Geographic just did a big special on, right?
Well, it's possible.
It's on Netflix. Yeah, it's like super ancient cave drawings and stuff like that.
Yeah, but these are places where we've identified where that transition was just starting to occur, right? And these are places that are already formed, like places where people are already settling and congregating and stuff.
So they were at separate times around the world then, right?
They were all roughly in the same time period in 4 different places in the world. This happened in China, in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, and in the Indonese Valley, which is
when you say
India.
about the same time, do you mean like within the same century?
Yeah, like at the end of the Younger Dryas period, which is the end of the last ice age that we had. That ended somewhere about 15,000 years ago.
Okay.
Right, 12,000 years ago. Right at that time, you start seeing structures like Jericho, you start seeing structures like Göbekli Tepe, right? Fairly organized architectural structures that just kind of pop up out of nowhere. Prior to that is a big, long ice age. At the end of the Younger Dryas period, not only were people migrating across the continents of Europe because of the receding ice sheets and the rising levels of water, but there was also plants. A lot of the plants were starting to die and change because of the conditions starting to change again. So the whole idea of whatever they knew about their environment within generations became a mystery again. Like it was wiped clean. Like whatever they had known to survive this last ice age had been wiped clean. That knowledge wiped clean because the landscape and the flora and the fauna literally changed in this process.
Sure.
So they had to readapt to new places, new types of plants, new types of animals, and this process has to start again, right?
And the birth of pharmacology, right?
Exactly, yeah. So or
modern pharmacology, I guess, is because if all the previous knowledge was erased.
They call it horticultural science, and they separate it from agricultural science. The difference, they said, was in the texts that I have read, is that horticultural science is cultivating like a garden, a thing that has a lot of different things in it, whereas agricultural science is when they start getting whole tracts of land that just has one crop on it.
Okay.
And they're rotating. Eventually, they become rotating crops and things like that, and irrigating fields and stuff. But this is even before that, right? This is just when the idea is starting to catch on, when people are starting to realize that they can gather these seeds up, because plants don't produce a lot of seeds in the wild, and spreading them in one spot and creating a patch of something that they want, right?
Right.
Now, you might ask, why would this be important to these people? Because we're talking about Neolithic people who have never seen a city, people who live egalitarian lives where there's like a barter system pretty much, right? They usually have 3 or 4 leaders in their tribes. They usually have an elder who's the oldest, and keep in mind the lifespan on average was about 20 years for Neolithic people. So maybe an old guy might be like 40 or something, that'd be pretty awesome, like he would know stuff. And they would have the strongest dude at the time who would be the leader of the hunt, because these are still nomadic people. They're living no fewer than 13, more than about 32.
Okay.
Because any fewer than 13, there's literally not enough people to organize a hunt. Or to bring in enough food that you can just gather.
Efficiently, right?
Yeah, efficiently to feed everybody,
Right.
right? But more than 32, you can't hunt efficiently enough to supply that much food for people, right? Because the food is always moving and shit. You've got to keep moving with that food. So
yeah, but couldn't you? I mean, the Native Americans organized much larger than that.
Well,
right?
In the Native American times, you're talking about a little bit later in history where the ice ages had totally receded and the land was literally a sea of buffaloes that they would just drive off cliffs in some cases. It was really easy for them in particular. It wasn't. They weren't coming out of this last ice age thing, where times were really rough and nobody knew what was going on.
So it's kind of like Nile Delta type shit as far as how accessible nourishment and nutrition and things were to them.
Yeah. They didn't, and largely they didn't know what was what, right? Again, they're learning, generationally speaking, in this time period, what they can eat, what they can't eat, what's going to kill them, and what's not, right? And let me get back to that later. But I wanted to point out, when we asked earlier, why would it be important that they would cultivate anything? Like
right.
What perhaps would be the reason? And I wanted to read out of a couple of books, just a couple of passages. Secrets of the Ice Age by Evan Haddingham, I believe.
Yeah, Haddingham. Yeah.
If you want to look at this book, and this is on page 39, if you find it, and there's a discovery that consisted of a skeleton of a man about 50 laid to rest in a shallow, artificially dug grave. The man had been buried on his back, head facing the cardinal direction of west, with the right arm bent and the legs drawn up toward the body. Around him lie numerous fragments of quartz, flint, ochre, and animal bones, but since the soil around the grave pit was also littered with such objects, it's difficult to know if they were deposited intentionally as offerings at the old man's burial. There were, so that's one example of a Neolithic gravesite that they found. Another one at Shanidar Cave in Iraq, 9 Neanderthals were uncovered during the 1960s, several of whom had been struck down by boulders tumbling from the roof of the cave. The fate of several victims seemed to have aroused a surprisingly delicate response among the living occupants of the cave. Ashes and food remains discovered amongst the stones placed over Shanidar burials indicate that funeral feasts were held in honor of the dead. The most remarkable discovery was that one burial had occurred at the end of May or early July, as determined from the pollen traces of 8 different types of brightly colored wild flowers that accompanied the burial. These flowers were probably woven into the branches of a shrub to form a kind of screen placed with the dead body by the Neanderthals, who were perhaps more sensitive than their conventional image allows. The point of me reading those passages, that was on page 54, is to show that we've found burials of Neanderthal people where it really looks like the Neanderthals were performing some sort of ritual.
Okay.
They were connecting rare substances in their environment, sometimes from far away from their environment, that they've carried to their environment. These quartz, these crystals, and these 8 different kinds of flowers that are specifically brightly colored. I mean, clearly, they put a lot of thought behind it, right? And maybe there was more than just thought behind it. Maybe these things were accoutrements to their spiritual rituals.
Sure.
Okay, because shamanism is full of rituals, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what's being shown here is that even in the period that Neanderthals became on the scene in around 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, you're seeing that there is possibly evidence for saying that these people had some type of religion, even though they didn't have writing to write it down, right? And of course, religion, when it was written down, didn't just pop up with it writing down. It was in existence and orally transmitted prior to being written down, right?
Right.
The oral tradition. So we're talking about how these oral traditions formed in the first place, right? But clearly, back in Neanderthal times, you can see the foundations for rituals, and if you've got rituals, you probably have some sort of mythology, okay? Because rituals are tied to mythology.
Right.
What they specifically do is they bring the present time period that you're in, or rather, they bring the point in their mythology that they're doing the ritual for into present time. It takes sacred time and brings it into the profane time, making profane time sacred time. So every time you reenact a ritual, you are going back to that time, that the thing that you're doing the ritual for happened, and that's called in ilio tempore, which is Latin meaning time immortal. That you're basically you're connecting yourself with that metaphysical, mythological beginning. So you keep repeating this religion, right? And so one of these things that would probably repeat it is like we've seen in these burials. And if it's repeated like we found in these burials, then it's probably underlying religion connected to that ritual, right? And I just wanted to read another passage here. This is from Patterns in Comparative Religion by Marcia Eliade.
Yeah, Eladia.
Eladia, maybe?
Yeah, Eliade.
We're on page 393, I believe. Or, well, starting on 392. Under periodic reoccurrence, the eternal present. In religion, as in magic, the periodic reoccurrence of anything signifies primarily that a mythical time is made present and then used to identify with. Every ritual has the character of happening now at this very moment. At the time of the event that the ritual commemorates or reenacts is made present, represented, so to speak, however far back it may have been an ordinary reckoning. Christ's passion, death, and resurrection are not simply remembered during the services of Holy Week. They really happen then before the eyes of the faithful, which the Catholics call transconfiguration.
Right, because they actually believe that after the sacrament's been blessed and everything, right, that's Eucharist, actually, or right, the Eucharist is actually flesh and blood.
Yeah.
So, yep.
And a convinced Christian must feel that he is contemporary with these transhistoric events, for by being reenacted, the time of the theophany becomes actual. So here what they're saying, what they're talking about is that the reason why somebody performs a ritual, generally speaking, is because it connects them metaphysically with the time that ritual represents, right?
Okay.
So the religion that it represents is the myth of their culture.
Sure.
At this point, it's just oral myth, right? But you can still see that they've got these rituals. They also had music. We have found flutes, bone flutes carved out of mammoth tusks, right? So, Neanderthals were artistic. They made jewelry. They wrote music and played music. They had rituals for life and death. They understood these things.
Right.
So they had a touch to that metaphysical realm.
So, so obviously, I think what you're doing here is you're setting the framework.
Yes.
For a big revelation, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and because a lot of people don't realize that when they think of Neanderthals, they think of cavemen, right? They don't think of people making jewelry and writing music and having their own religion. And you could never prove that they had their own religion. You can only point to the things I'm talking about, but it seems like they probably did.
Seem to connect them with religions we can prove, right? We can see that there's I guess what
there's
you're
all
saying,
kinds of death rituals in ancient religions. I mean, just as an example, the Egyptian religion, which has mummifications and stuff. Sorry.
Okay, so where do we get the proof then that there was some sort of...
So, in a Neolithic hunting-gathering society, before you have the Neolithic Revolution or the Agrarian Revolution, there is a period where these people had to figure out what was what. When I was saying earlier, they had to figure out what if they ate gave them nutrition, what gave them stimulants, what poisoned them and killed them, what made them trip if they ate it, and, what wasn't nutritious, that was worthless, right? They had to discover these things before they could cultivate these things.
Right.
And in general, if not specifically, in the society, it was a male-dominate society, right? The males decided what was going to happen, which way they were going to migrate, how they were going to follow the herd and stuff, and that was the main source of food. Was the
But yeah, you said hunting cultures are are male centric
Well,
and agrarian.
no, I'm talking. That's later in ancient history, before the prehistory. That once religions were established, the religion, if the head was a male deity, it was in every case because the society that had that religion was a herding society, as opposed to a society that was an agrarian society, which I was going to get to that point too, but that's like later, because we got prehistory, then ancient history, and classical.
You want to start literally at the beginning.
Literally at the beginning.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm still rolling back a little bit, right?
Okay.
So we got back to these Neanderthals, so yeah, I'm trying to forget where I was at. Oh, I know. Okay, so the dynamics of that kind of society, where it's male driven, right? Those are the people that's making the decisions. The females don't really have much decision making power at that time. The men hunted and the women gathered. The men hunted, and that was the main supply of their food. So they kind of got better treatment because of necessity, right? You have to listen to them. They're stronger than you, they're bigger than you, and they hunt and they feed you, and right?
In this particular case, they literally are your survival.
Right. I'm not saying that they treated their women bad or anything like that. I'm just saying if it came down to it, there was no question, right? The women had no power, really. I mean, other than whatever affection they could garner from their mate, because they were there for kids. I mean, they're not going to kill their women because they love them probably, and they're going to need kids, right? So, but what the women did do is they gathered. They did hunt a little bit. They hunted with nets and for small game like squirrel and rabbit and stuff like that. But they mostly gathered, right? So the men have a lot less selection in terms of what they're going to hunt than the women do when it comes to going out and gathering shit, right? Because when you're out gathering the flora, there's a lot of flora, right? Mm-hmm. Compared to whatever fauna happens to be in that ecological system, right? And out of all of those, you're probably going to only hunt something that you can kill, something that's nutritious. So you're
and isn't going to kill you back,
right?
Hopefully,
so, right. So you're narrowing your choices.
Right.
So 4 or 5 things, maybe, right? In any one region, they would roam for 200 or 300 square miles, right? Generally, and they had different little campsites that they would be at.
Okay.
So the women would go out and they would gather. So when it comes to the idea that somebody is going to, at some point, find out what substances in their area produce a psychotropic effect, it's going to be the women, because the women are going to be the people that gathered the plant that produces this psychotropic effect.
That makes sense, right?
Okay, it's not going to be the men. They're hunting animals, and eating animal flesh doesn't make you trip,
right?
And you know, be aware, in their world, if they had music and if they had a way of communicating, which it seems like they did, if they were organizing for hunting and such,
right,
and building, like in Göbekli Tepe and Jericho and all these places, that, I mean, recognize that they probably had a spiritual side to them that they would nourish, you know, that they understood what the metaphysical was, right? That they had a concept that when somebody died, they were no longer here. They may not have known where they went, but that place was the other place. Because people clearly came and went from someplace else, right? When people were born, there they were, but when they would die, their body would be there, but their life would be gone.
But they would, I mean, I'm assuming, would still have otherworldly experiences naturally because they would dream.
Well, yeah,
right, yeah.
But I mean, if you're looking for physical assurance in your life, death and birth are 2 good ones too. I mean, but yeah, I fully think that dreaming is another one of those experiences, right? Where your dreams is giving you the idea that there is this metaphysical place that's not the plane that you live on, not the earth that you live on, right? That there's some other place. And the assumptions are that dreams, life, death, all emanate from this place, whatever this place is, and perhaps any other mystery that you might care to throw in there. If
Right.
you don't know what lightning is and it strikes a tree and makes a loud noise and maybe sets some stuff on fire and you don't know what fire is, or maybe you do, right? But if you need to explain something, my point is that once you've got this idea that there's some other place, you can ascribe that that's the place that these things come and go to, and that you have to understand this other place if you want to understand these deeper mysteries in the place that you're in, right?
Right.
So that's all well and good, and everybody has dreams and everybody lives and dies. But imagine what it might have been like to the first people who gathered up some plants, and perhaps these plants could be cannabis plants, they could be peyote, they could be psychedelic mushrooms, which the Indians called flesh of the gods, connected to ancient Vedic traditions, as peyote is connected to the ancient American Indian traditions.
That's right. I mean, we don't have to go very far back in history to see evidence of factual evidence that psychotropic drugs directly influenced a religion.
Various religions.
You're right. I mean, especially in Central America, South America, and the Midwest, right?
And the idea that being in a meditative state or an entranced state
Sweat
or
lodges.
Euphoric state, sweat lodges and stuff, and so but we can get to that too in ancient times, but still back here in this prehistory, can you imagine the first people that found a truly psychotropic substance that once they consumed it, it was a literal awake factual change? And also there's DMT, which is in every living thing and in lots of plants, which is known as the spirit molecule. And if you want to check that out, you can look on Netflix. There's a documentary called DMT, the spirit molecule, and you can check it out. It's pretty cool. I can get more into that here in a minute, but
I think it's hosted by like Joe Rogan or something like that, right?
I really don't know. It's a documentary. You'd have to see. I watched it, but it's been a while. I don't think it was, but I may not have known when I seen it. I may not have known who he was. Like, I really didn't know who he was until you started showing me. Remember, because when we were watching the fighting video, I was like, "Oh, that's a comedian guy." And you're like, "No, he's actually a fighter." That's oh, I don't know who he is, so I might have missed him. But so if you found a substance that gave you a physical change in identity and in your perspective, right? That would be the thing that would really solidify for you that there was in fact this metaphysical realm, because you went there, right? You tripped with these mushrooms or with this cannabis or with this peyote or any number of things. And you had a physical change that you can't deny. And so, not only that, you can repeat it.
You're not saying, though, that if you take acid, you actually see God. You're saying that people who did take some sort of psychotropic drug thought they were seeing God, right?
I'm not saying they...
You're not making a case that
I'm not saying they were seeing God. I'm saying that they felt a spiritual transition from the world that they perceived, the real world, into a different world. They had a spiritual shift, like anyone who is tripped on mushrooms or tripped on acid will tell you that there's a definite perspective shift, right? It's not.
So you're not advocating that if you're trying to have a higher understanding of God and the universe that you run out and take psychotropic drugs or anything like that?
And I'm not.
Okay.
I mean, everybody. I mean,
You're saying that ancient people probably did this, and this is why it works.
Still, people to this day do this.
Well, yeah, they sure do. Sweat lodges. There was a self-help, I can't think of his name, a self-help guru type guy that ran a sweat lodge, and some people died.
Yeah, you gotta know what you're doing. Like, I'm not telling people to do this. What I'm saying, if you choose to do anything like this with any of these substances, that's between you and your religion. It's not really something that I don't even I'm an anti-theist. I don't even believe in
Right.
gods or religion. So
I just
I'm
wanted
not
to
saying
sort of
you
make
should
that
do this.
clear, so if someone's listening to this, you're not making it. You're not advocating.
No, I'm not advocating anything. I'm talking
anything
about
that's mind altering.
stuff
You're ever going to find some sort of god.
No, I'm
or
speaking completely
higher
historically
truth.
and academically, and encourage people to look up the things that I'm talking about,
Okay.
and make their own judgment on these things. And I can't say that these things truly invented religion, right? I'm going to talk more about it, but I'm not going to say that because I don't even believe in that to begin with, right?
Okay.
And I'm not also saying that religion or the spiritual world is fake and that drugs made that. It could just as easily be that drugs are the metaphysical bridge that gets you to that place, and it is a real place, right? I'm not even saying that it's not real and made up by drugs. I'm just saying that throughout history, from prehistory times to throughout history, that psychotropic substances have been deeply connected and intertwined with spirituality and religion, right?
It's undeniable, right?
Before religion was even religion, there was that connection. Okay, now, if you were the person that found these psychotropic substances, and you're the guess is it's the women folk, right? Because they're the one gathering stuff, right?
Right.
So one or two of these people, because we're talking about 13 to 32 groups of 13 to 32. At some point, one or two of these people found some kind of substance that allowed them to trip. Not only that, but that they could validate by repeating. Like if they're like, I was touched by the gods, and that'll never happen again. All they had to do was repeat the process, take the same substance again, and they would realize that they had a key to a metaphysical world. They were able to be the guardian, the gatekeeper, the keeper of the key to the door to let a person into the spiritual world that existed. And if the person didn't believe that the spiritual world existed, you could always, so to speak, slip them a Mickey to prove to them that in fact it did exist and that you were the person that made these things happen. So can you also imagine now that if you were the guys and the women came to you and started talking, hey, there is the spiritual realm and you need to pay heed to it, and you can't just decide to do it. If there was ever an argument where this became a power play and the males thought, well, you're full of crap, I don't believe you. All it would take would be for them to say, hey, everybody get together, let's build a big fire, we're going to drink some stuff, and we're going to have a ritual that I just created, right? That's based on what I have found out about the spiritual world. And I'm going to take you to this place and prove to you that it exists, right? And they don't know it's in the food. They don't know if it's in the performance of the ritual. They don't know if it's at the whim of what became the shamans,
you
right?
You could just call those sacred ingredients.
You could,
too,
but you don't know where it's coming from.
Right.
You can't say, you don't know what made you go into this world. As far as you know, the person that told you that this is going to happen to you and then it really happened to you is the person that made it happen to you. Like, you don't necessarily think, well, I got slipped a Mickey, right? You're not that's a modern perception, right? You're not thinking that, right? It's slipped into something that's brewed all the time. It's the added ingredient, and it causes the psychotropic thing to happen to you, right? That to me, and this is people speculate on this. I tend to speculate a little further because it's fun, but that to me is the separation of church and state right there, of the power play between the first shamans in Neolithic society were women that had this knowledge of the ability to take people into the spiritual realm, and then you had the male component that had the ability to crush their enemies and see them driven before them, and hear the lamentation of the women. And what did they have to fear before that? Everything was going their way, and then all of a sudden, holy crap, man!
There's an afterlife.
There's a whole other thing, and this one person or group of people seem to know. what's up with that, and it does seem important because there's a lot of mysteries in nature. They don't know they're living by the pulses of the equinox, right? They're living by nature, and this is a part of nature, and it's a physical change in them, right? So that would be the first time that women had this ability, this power. And if you look at shamanism and how it's handed down from one person to the next, and it's this always one person, it's not like somebody that they elect, right? Well, it's somebody that gets some knowledge, right? Yeah. And that's the
early versions of like a priesthood.
Yeah, exactly, right. So once you have the solid foundation that there is a metaphysical realm, the first thing that you would start doing if you were new to this priesthood, if you were the shaman, is you start interpreting and creating the rules of the metaphysical world. You start creating the dogma of what becomes a religion. This is what you do and what you don't do. And it's ancient wisdom. It's not like these people are making up bad stuff. They're looking back and they're taking it seriously, and they're dealing and struggling with issues that have been at the crux of human nature from the beginning. And so they're not wasting the potential that they got with these keys. They're trying their best to make a religion that's adequate for them and their culture and their time and place and history. So in that sense, there's a lot of speculation academically that psychotropic substances, beyond not being intimately connected, only being intimately connected with proto-religions, but that they may have spurred those religions on. They may have given them the actual foundation that was needed to convince people who were natural skeptics, so to speak. Well, wait a minute, you haven't seen our shaman, you haven't went through our ritual, right? You don't know. And now you do. You've had an apocalyptic revelation. The veil has been unveiled to you, and it's some serious shit. Yeah. And everybody agrees. And then, like, you got that trip, and nobody else did. Everybody was tripping balls, and they're all, oh man, yeah, that was, I don't know, you know.
We all went there together.
Right? Yeah. This is something we got to talk about this. So I mean, it's like a power play, right? It's like the first power play. It would have been the first time that women had any ability to play a power card, if that was ever done. That would have been the first time. They would have been the gatekeepers. And if men eventually became shamans, it was because the information was passed on to them by the females. And females developed language and culture too. They, not being out at the hunt so much, they developed language, and they were instrumental in cultivating the crops. When you put a bunch of chicks
together, they like to talk?
It's true. It's true. It's true. That's how men were able to see shades of green, genetically speaking, more than women can. They can see more variations in shades of green, and they have better depth perception, which is where that whole woman can't drive cars or park thing comes from. It's a matter of depth perception. Men can see and judge depth better on average than women, and they can see more shades of green. And this directly comes from them being out and throwing spears at something at some distance away in a green world, right? And women, like when you argue with your wife or your girlfriend or your mom and you're a guy, when communication break down, what happens? The guys get pissed, the women start crying.
Right.
Because when words fail, women become emotional and men become angry. Because women need these words to communicate their emotions, because it's the foundation of their genetics and stuff. So my point is if they created language and spurred along the beginnings of needing to cultivate something, because here we come back to these early ancient settlements that we find at circa 9,000, 10,000 years ago, or 12,000 even, where you see the first cultivation of crops and stuff. And these are just the crops that we recognize, that we see, right? There's maybe no trace of other types of crops, right? But the need for this didn't probably start with the need for growing crops, because it's already been established that the egalitarian lifestyle was actually easier, that you actually had more time on your hands in a hunting and gathering society than you did as a farmer. And any farm kid will probably tell you that that's the case.
I've spent enough summers on the back of a freaking hay wagon to figure that out, man.
There's stuff to do always, around the clock, equinox to equinox.
Those experiences are what made me get into engineering, because I was like, I ain't fucking doing this for the rest of my life, man. Nope.
There's no rest. So yeah, the egalitarian lifestyle of hunting and gathering, you had more time on your hands, right? So, you know, and they're starting to see one of the big revelations about things like Göbekli Tepe was that not only that people were organizing and doing these massive works of stone, but also... Let's see, I lost my train of thought because I wanted to point out that that's what Neolithic meant. That lithic was Latin for stone, and neo was new. So it meant new Stone Age, and it was just designating the point in time when people were building with these massive 20-ton stones. And here's the question I just want to ask people if you're listening. If you're cutting stone, why aren't you cutting it like in 1 pound bite-sized chunks that people can stack up and carry and build easily with, right? Why are you cutting it in 20-ton slabs?
Because it's hard to move.
But it was happening everywhere. Like everyone just thought, I guess in the beginning, let's use large stones, like the sarsen stones in Stonehenge.
Look, that if you wanted to build something that was eternal, you wouldn't want to build it out of man-carryable bite-sized chunks, because then it would be easy for people to, if you build it, to just as easy to take it down.
That has to be what they were thinking.
So that's always been my premise, is that why do they make these things so freaking big? Well, they made them big so that people couldn't just easily, and even today we can't just easily take these things apart. But you look at the pyramids, right? The pyramids had a skin on them at one time, but those pieces could be carted off, and they got carted off. You know, they're gone.
Yeah, that's true. And if you ask the ancient alien people, they'll tell you it's because they had anti-gravity, so it was easy. It didn't really matter.
I'm not saying it's extraterrestrials, but it's extraterrestrials. Tsoukalos, right?
Yeah. Giorgio Tsoukalos. Who is the guy with the hair?
Yep.
So
Neolithic, New Stone Age, right?
And somewhere before that I was heading somewhere. But... These early settlements. Oh, I was talking about like the need to cultivate and religion and stuff like that. So my point was that before these new settlements were made out of these stones, before it was the Neolithic, the New Stone period, it was the Old Stone period, the Paleolithic, right?
Okay.
And in that period is when this agrarian revolution, this Neolithic revolution happened, and they started cultivating crops. And what I'm suggesting is that the need to cultivate crops first came from the need to have access to psychotropic substances. The whole idea that we need to keep this stuff with us, or we're going to lose this power and this knowledge that we have. We need to find a way to keep this with us. And if we can't, we need to find a way to be in one spot, to grow enough of it to get to the next spot.
Okay.
Because they're not stopping at these camps and starting to grow food because it's easier, right? Because it's not as easy as the hunting and gathering life. It's harder. The farm work is harder. They're not stopping and growing this stuff because they're running out of meat. And they're not doing it because it's easy, because they're just now learning what stuff is because of all the changing environments and stuff. So the agrarian revolution didn't necessarily happen because it needed to happen, because it was a better way of life, right? So what would be the need? Why did it happen? What I'm suggesting is that the reason that it happened was the need to cultivate these psychotropic substances and any other stimulant kind of substances or anything like that, not necessarily just psychotropic substances, but things like nicotine or cocaine or things like that, or even any kind of narcotics, like anything that you would find in nature that would change your mental persuasion. Right. So,
and what's hilarious about, if you think about it, this shit seems to grow everywhere.
Yeah, some kind of psychotropic substance does, and DMT definitely does.
So it's been, I imagine it started, a lot of the stuff like opiates and things like that, opium, hair, which the humans derived from.
Mm-hmm.
They've been interbred with other species to make them
More potent.
more potent, and also more resilient.
Yeah,
and so they can be grown in other places, right? Because like if you're saying that, if they're taking them with them,
or staying long enough to generate enough to take to the next spot, right?
Right.
That could have been the genesis for why they started staying in places to begin with. And then once you have a religion, and there's a reason for people to go to holy sites, right? Once you have a religion and things happen in your culture,
right?
And it doesn't take that many generations to have. It doesn't take that many generations for you to forget the actual events that occurred, and they become mythological, right? You're telling them through oral tradition. So really quickly they get put in your mythology. But that threw my mind off too. Just like someone texting me. But what was you asking me? We were
talking about how even today a lot of these substances grow on like 80% of the land mass of the planet.
Oh, I guess
they're very hardy. They're very hardy substances. And that being said, that would have been something, because that's how a lot of modern day crops are done that way, right? It's gene editing in a sense, right? You're creating hybrid plants that have characteristics that you prefer.
Yeah.
Right. And they were doing it with animal husbandry too. They were breeding in certain specific traits in their livestock and stuff that they wanted as well. And all their animals, from dogs, canines, all of it. So,
but they originally may have done it out of the necessity to need that psychotropic substance as a foundation for this proto-religion that they were starting to build these structures from, right?
I mean, it probably wasn't a lot of entertainment at night around the fire. It wasn't like you could just throw the TV on, right?
No, but these...
So getting everybody all whacked out on some sort of trippy freaking drink would be highly entertaining.
And but that's true. But to build these 20-ton structures like Stonehenge and Göbekli Tepe and all these other places, you're going to need more than just a good time. You're going to need a belief system that allows people to believe and congregate and organize and do these
and labor
deeds and make these laborious deeds, right? So that to me points that there is already an underlying religion. We just don't know what it is. It's a proto-religion because they're gathering before even cities and making giant temples under the guise of religion, right?
There's no real evidence, right, that it like Göbekli Tepe, that things like precious metals like gold or diamonds and things like that had any influence on the people that were organizing, right? Like they traded in perishable goods, right? They traded in livestock, and they traded in pelts and these kinds of things. So it'd be really hard to amass compactly amass a ton of wealth that you could use as influence. So there had to be, you're kind of saying there had to be something else, right?
Right.
And
that
what
would be
was that?
Religion.
Right?
That would be, to me,
like a belief system.
A belief system, a religion for all purposes, just one not written down and not codified only in the sense that it's not written down. Definitely codified in the sense that people were able to organize and build giant Neolithic structures.
Right.
Right. So they had to be at least that organized. If they would have had a language at that point, they would have probably written it down, and it probably would be considered to be one of our ancient religions. We would just roll the clock back on our history and say that these ancient religions now date back to these periods, right? Even before cities. And maybe that's because of psychotropic substances, the need to be in one place long enough to have a supply because they're integral to the religion that you're founding. Now, in ancient times, two things I want to point out.
Okay.
First thing about in the Neolithic period about Göbekli Tepe is there's a lot of scholarly debate right now talking about how cities got formed, because it was assumed that the reason why cities were formed was because of the agrarian revolution, right? People had to settle in one spot to raise a bunch of crops, and then they stored those crops like through the seasons.
Okay.
And when they stored those crops, they had to find somebody to guard those crops. And so corruption is a human standard, So you had to find people that weren't corruptible, if you could, which necessitated that there had to be laws that were created. For instance, if people were corruptible and did something that was corruptive, if that's a word, corruptive, there would be a penalty for it. So the whole idea of laws happening, the laws are supposed to come from the gods, right? But the whole idea of laws is probably occurring because people for the first time are in one spot and they've got something to fight over, which is the stored grain, which they have to guard not only from outside people who are still living in an egalitarian lifestyle, but from their own corrupt people within, and the land that they grow these crops on. Because as these city-states cropped up and people started doing this, they started using more and more land, and eventually the land started connecting together, and that's when disputes of the very first kind start happening in the history of man, the first wars.
And they're all like these different societies that sort of have sprung up and have developed their own mythologies and oral traditions.
A lot of times kind of stuff, they even shared the same mythology and the same history, the same oral history and stuff, but they had nationalism in the sense that they were city-states. It was like small-scale nationalism. And once these cities got so big and started coming into contact with each other, by the time that we see this happening in recorded history about 5,000 years ago, about 7,000 years ago is the first recorded history we have of a standing army and a phalanx formation. Like they're in a square formation. They're all got the same weapon and the same armor, right? So at least by that period of time, which is right after these city-states start forming, you've got a reason, apparently, to fund a fully trained and armed and armored army that's standing, right? So, and wars start breaking out between these city-states and stuff. But religion was there at the same time. Like these
it was there before civilization.
What was
religion?
Yeah. So when the first cities crop up, the whole
they kind of crop up out of
religion,
organized religions.
Well, right? That in organized religion is there in those cities when those cities pop up. But the idea of civilization and social strata seems to come from the agrarian revolution shift, where now these people who are all in one spot, they all have a place, right? Like, and some of the earliest, most extensive laws of these ancient cultures, like Sumerian and Babylonian and Egyptian culture, are what to do if slaves run away or steal or do things like that, because they had a whole group of people. There are problems
of those times.
Well, yeah, because they had all these people that were working the fields. Like, if you didn't have people doing what they were supposed to do, then your society broke down, right? It was harder, and you needed people to do certain things, and they had their place in society. In fact, by the time the ancient times come, which is where we're talking about now with this idea, and also comes the idea of rationing the grain and rationing the work. So with the idea of rationing comes the idea of social strata. People who either have the same or have more or have an easier life because they're not toiling in the fields and they're weaving baskets or whatever, right?
And that's not fair.
Well, it certainly causes friction, apparently.
Yeah, right. So, hey, what do you got? Oh, I don't got that. I think we need to have a disagreement, right? It's
right.
That's just how it always.
And you can't just move over there because you're fighting over land.
Shit. Jesus.
Yeah. So, I mean, in a lot of ways, the move to the agrarian society was not necessarily beneficial to the human condition in that sense. It caused a lot of bad stuff. It caused a lot of good stuff too, technology and stuff. But nevertheless, by this time that this happens, you know, you've got firmly established mythology and firmly established religion and firmly established ritual that ends up morphing from that point into essentially everything we have today.
Right.
And so this is just a point of academia that people are considering. It's not necessarily.
Well, you can't. But from after the Neolithic period, right? Is that because that's when we start getting recorded history? Is it not? As right after the Neolithic, okay. After the Neolithic period, though, this shit's getting recorded that it's being done.
Right.
So it's not. So from that point forward, this is recorded history. It's not like nobody's making this up. You're saying that it happened. We know that it happened. But so you're saying because of that, we're kind of assuming it also happened in the prehistory, yes. Prehistoric period as well.
Yes.
Okay. So where does it first show up then in recorded history?
Religion?
No. The influence of psychotropic substances, right? Because that's what I mean. That's recorded, right? That's not speculation. Right. That's there.
Solidly in a few cases. One of the ones that comes to mind first is the oracles of Delphi, the Pythian sisters. The
Pythian sisters?
Yeah.
Were they hot?
Maybe. They were hot, probably high. I don't know if that means they're hot, but the many people in ancient times would send people to the Oracle of Delphi.
The many people?
Many people.
Yeah, what's
of
that?
Ancient times, like
a lot of people.
people.
Okay, I thought you meant like small people.
No.
Oh, wait a minute.
Hobbits
Are we gonna start
of the ancient times.
Gulliver's Travels now? Man, you're losing me. I'm sorry, go ahead. So a lot of people in ancient times.
Yeah, in ancient times. From like Persia and from Greece and other places would send people, Egypt would send people to the oracle at Delphi. And this is also in some of our most ancient literature, like Oedipus, which talks about the Oracle of Delphi. And there has been research done.
Well, Oedipus was drugged or something, right? Is that what?
No, he was cursed.
Cursed. That's
yeah,
what
he
it
was told by the Oracle of Delphi that he was cursed, and that if he ever went back home, that he would kill his father and marry his mother and have sex with her and have kids with her. And so he, as far as he knew, had been born in Corinth, and so he stayed away from there. And then one day, on a place where three roads met, these wagon was coming by, and the guy's like, "Hey, get out of the way. The king is in the wagon, get the hell off the road." And the guy's like, "No." It was like a road rage incident. And so he killed the guy that was driving the wagon and killed the old man that was inside. And a foot soldier ran off, and he couldn't catch him. So a while later, he ends up heading into Thebes of Greece, and they were under a miasma, which is kind of like a sickness or a curse where something's wrong and you need to do something to fix it. And
a malaise.
Yeah, a malaise, miasma. And so to get into the town or leave the town to begin with, you had to face a sphinx and answer the riddle, and nobody could do that. And so Oedipus answered the riddle and then ended up...
Wait. Back up a little bit. Like of Egypt, a sphinx?
Mm-hmm. Yep, head of a female, wings of an eagle, and body of a lion. Sphinx. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So that's in ancient
Greece.
Ancient Greece prior to Egypt.
Not prior to Egypt.
No, so okay.
Not prior, just they knew about it because they were all connected through the Minoans in ancient and right before ancient times in prehistory. Okay. But he answers the riddle, he kills the Sphinx, and he comes in, and they send another oracle to Delphi to ask what's up with this miasma malaise. And they say that, what's wrong is that there's this evil, there's a sickness, and that's got to be expelled and stuff. And it turns out it's him, because when he killed the Sphinx, they let him into the town. They thought it was great, and they made him like the king, and so he married the queen. And recently, the king had been killed because he had killed him like a few months prior, and he didn't know it. So he ends up marrying his mom and having kids with her, and then he finds out when they send someone to the Oracle of Delphi, and then he gets banished, and he pokes his eyes out, and it's a story. It's an ancient story. It's good stuff.
Okay.
And at the Oracle of Delphi, there's people who had done some work conducted by John R. Hale, Julie Zellinga de Boer, Jeffrey P. Chantron, and Henry A. Speller that suggests that the prophecies of the Oracle of Delphi were under the influence of gaseous vapors exuded from the ground. Their findings are published in Questioning the Delphic Oracle, Overview / An Intoxicating Tale. And there's been documentaries on this too. It's not just that particular work, but if you want to look at the academia, you can go and read their paper. But essentially it says that they built the Oracle of Delphi over a area where there was a fissure in the ground and gases came up that got you high and stuff, and people had been going here.
Well, it could be carbon monoxide poisoning.
Yeah, yeah.
You know I mean,
yeah. They talk
right?
about what it is, and I can't remember exactly, but yeah, I mean, a lot of things may have caused that altered state. But the point is that because it did that consistently, people went to that spot and considered it a holy spot before recorded history. Before ancient times, people have been coming there. People knew about this spot, and then in ancient times, they built
like a temple around
it. Yeah, and they continued to use it, right? And it was a big deal for them. But the state of ecstasy was achieved by some sort of an induced drug that created a psychotropic effect, which is where they would get these revelations from when people would come in and ask them questions and stuff. And then, generally they were really vague and stuff, but this is all throughout the ancient world, and this particular thing is all throughout the ancient world, and that's just one of the things that one of the examples in ancient times. Of course, we talked about psychedelic mushrooms called the flesh of the gods that's connected with the Vedic traditions. And people would eat these mushrooms and for spiritual reasons, or cannabis and its association with Rastafarians and their religion, peyote, associated with the American Indian traditions, and all of these ancient traditions. There's in ancient times that we know about, that we've got recorded information, because we know, I just rattle all these off, right? That these drugs are connected firmly with the religion. I think that's what you were asking, right? Like what in ancient times were the first signs, and these would be the first signs, like the Oracle of the Oracle of Delphi. Delphi. Oh my gosh, and all of the other religions and stuff, and that connections. These would be the ones that you first see popping up in written history that you can look back to and say, well, they were there as far as we know from the beginning.
Right. Now, I've heard this too, that in the temples, that there's evidence that cannabis was in the temples of Israel as part of their. The story I heard was, I thought it was funny because apparently they would take olive oil or some sort of oil, and it would be like an extraction. They would stuff these jars full of these plants, and then put the oil in. Somehow that the psychoactive agent would leach out of the plants into the oil, and that this is the oil that they would like pour over their heads and rub all over their bodies and stuff. Then they would run into the temple, and guess what? They talked to God. I'm like, I bet they fucking did.
There's for cannabis in particular, a lot of our record for that particular plant comes from around 1100 AD. It's a little bit later in time, but nevertheless, even the first time we see it mentioned in Arabic and Israeli cases, it's there. Like who knows how long it's been there. This is just the first record we found of it.
Right.
I mean, they could even find records that predate what we found now.
Right.
But we just don't know. I mean, it's been with us for a long time.
So so let's say they're there, right? That's the argument that you're making. Okay, so what can you directly attribute in religions? I mean, obviously the Oracle of Delphi, right, is one where you can say, these guys were all getting whacked out on some sort of gas that was coming out of the ground, right? Whatever that might be. So what other instances is there of that direct correlation, or that that can be found?
Well, in the other cultures that I've talked about, like for instance, let's take the Indian, the American Indian, and the peyote. They would smoke those in peace pipes when they would have powwows and
Right.
stuff. So, there is another religion where we have a record of them directly using it in their religion. In a specific function.
Sure, but that's the easy one, right? That's the one that everybody here understands. Native Americans.
There's that. There's the
Right.
Oracle of Delphi. So that's
Right.
two. And so let's go for a third one. Talk about the Vedic traditions and the flesh of the gods and them eating mushrooms. In almost every case that they would eat these mushrooms, it was to enter into like a tantric state. To enter in a state of meditation
Right,
and
yeah.
stuff, and that they would contemplate their spirituality and their faith, and so they're using it as a tool to become more spiritually aligned with what they consider to be
Right.
appropriate, right?
Right.
So, like, there's another instance of in ancient times them using this specifically in their religion for a specific purpose, just like the Indians used it for a peace pipe, and to be honest, I don't really know what the Rastafarians use cannabis for. I mean, I know that it helps them enter an altered state of mind, which is the basis of what I'm saying all of
Right.
these drugs do to help with religion. The ancient Greeks called it nympophilia. Like necrophilia, but nympophilia. And it was when you were possessed by that, you were in a state of ecstasy. And in Greek, that word means that you were outside of your body, meaning that you had bridged the gap into the metaphysical world, right? So they had a word for it, right? They had a word for entering this state. And of course, they were big users of the Oracle of Delphi.
Sure,
So
right.
They were big believers in this state that you would get into, the state of ecstasy. It didn't matter how you got into the state of ecstasy. What matters is that you got into the state of ecstasy so that you could connect more firmly with that metaphysical world. And to be fair, these were all apparently natural substances, these mushrooms, these plants, and these gases, right? Like, it's not like they're not natural. They're not a part of the environment. Like, I'm sure that the thought these must be meant to be used and must be taken seriously.
Like in a video game, right? When they sparkle.
Yeah. What is this?
That's a quest item.
Yeah, we got to get this. We don't know what it does yet, but we'll figure it out. So yeah, and
we know. Look, I mean, it's the term assassin comes from the Hassassin or whatever it is. They were huge opium heads, right? And that was a big part of that. I don't even think that's really a religion, right? That's like a cult of some sort. Those where all those assassins and everything came from. I think it was the Silk Road or whatever. It was in those times. But
gotcha, yeah,
so it's obviously had effects like that too.
Oh yeah. I mean, but by the time that happens, you're talking at probably late ancient times, getting into classical. Because by the time you start talking about what a lot of people say is ancient Rome, if you're talking about imperial Rome, you're talking about the classical era, right? So there's a division point there. But by the time you're at the end of the ancient going into the classical, the word's out, right? The cat's out of the bag, right? Shamanism's an old hat. It's passé. Now there's priesthoods and there's ways to do things, and they've been doing it for a long time, and these are prescribed ways, and there's enough population that's grown in these places that people can be involved in these issues and then get out of the involvement and take that knowledge with them, right? And start using these substances for more than a religious purpose and context, to use them in attempts of assassination, to use them for recreational purposes, to use them for medicinal purposes.
Sure. Wines and alcohol were definitely and are in that category, I would say, mind-altering substances.
Yes.
But you know what?
Sure.
Yeah, I would say we've never really seen those used in a religion, but then...
Well, the Catholic religion.
I was going to say, we have.
That's the first that comes to mind. And there's been others, too. I was reading about it. I didn't...
Where's the beer religion, man? I mean, a
lot of monks brewed beer. So.
Right? I mean, what is that?
I had some examples of alcohol being used in ancient religions, but I didn't bring them with me or abreast myself of them because we were focusing on psychotropic.
Right?
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it falls into the same category. I mean, for sure, in ancient times, like when they were building the pyramid, they were eating / drinking beer. It was a different kind of beer, much more frothy and thick than what we are used to, but it was beer.
Beer you can eat with a fork, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah. But I mean, they were using beer at ancient times, so very likely the idea of fermentation had been discovered before written history, in prehistory, and
well, it happens naturally.
Accordingly. Yeah,
it happens in fruit and stuff, and animals get. Have you ever seen this?
That's right. Squirrels and stuff. Pumpkins
pissed off their ass, man. Like, it's party time, you know. Right. And the video I saw, they're like all hanging out together too, right? It's like the elephants and the monkeys and the birds, and they're all just getting smashed together. And I'm like, shit. I've seen that literally in a bar.
Yeah, right. Right. The only difference is religion doesn't get in the way for them. They just have a good time.
They just having a good time, right? Yeah, right.
They don't have to do anything.
Up and putting the law down.
But that's my shtick, man. That's what I wanted to point out. That's what I wanted to talk about. That's what I wanted to propose. That's what I wanted to suggest that people check out if they have an interest on it. Again, not trying to say that there isn't a metaphysical realm or deities or gods
or whatever.
Yeah,
it's
this
just
could
that
just be the bridge to that.
There's a connection here,
right? There's a connection,
and it's provable and undeniable that it does have.
And it may have helped humanity get on its way in a lot of ways. It may have helped them conceptually. It may have helped them spiritually. It may have helped them to have the agrarian revolution, and it spurred on civilization.
It would certainly. It would certainly make sense of a lot of the profound miracles that are in a lot of religions, right? I mean, you know, the burning bushes.
There's a lot of mysticism for sure.
You see the size of that
manna
chicken?
From heaven,
you know?
like
manna from heaven.
40 years in the desert where you could hike across in a few days.
Right.
Like, I don't know what they're doing lost in that desert. Maybe just walking a straight line.
How messed up are you, right?
Right.
If you're that damn lost. Right?
Right. So, and I mean, then you get into things like vernacular of the Bible and whether things are supposed to be taken literally or spiritually.
Right. Or metaphorically.
Right.
Even.
Yeah.
Right.
So, but there is a lot of meat in that sort of stuff too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a lot of cool things. And I think, as this is maybe winding down, that the next time we might talk about science stuff.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to point out that my guest is wearing a T-shirt that has a 20-sided die on it that says, "This is how I roll." One of the other things I wanted to ask you about,
because I like Pythagoras.
In my intro, I talked about being the creator of worlds and the god of dragons and stuff, and what might be interesting to people to know is that, I grew up playing role-playing games. It's kind of how I met you, actually. It was through mutual friends that had a love for role-playing games. And then there are people that are into role-playing games, but then there's you, okay? Like, you're sort of a breed all on your own, right? And that you've actually got some projects you're sort of working on that could be profound into people that have followed Gary Gygax and that kind of thing. So
just a hobby for me, but
right.
Maybe.
But I think it would be kind of cool if you're up for it. I think a lot of people would be interested in, and I don't know if I can say much more about it than that or not. I'm not sure if you're okay with talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's nothing really going on. I've kind of put all that stuff on hold as I finish up.
But can you talk about what that stuff is?
Yeah, I can talk about it. Yeah.
So, I mean, so tell them what the name of it is and what kind of the context around what it is that you've been sort of working on here for years.
Just a game that I've been playing, and it's Gary Gygax wrote the game. It's called Dangerous Journeys, and it's a multi-genre role-playing game system. It's got mythos as its fantasy component, but also there was Unhallowed, which was its supernatural component, like horror, supernatural, and Changeling, which was its weird science genre module.
Right.
Those last two weren't published, but you can get them. You can get a hold of them online and from people. But this game is like not many people play it.
Not many people even know it exists.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, and the people that don't know
that's
much
what's
about how to
really
play
unique about it is there's not like hardly anybody that even knows the rules
right.
to the thing.
It's starting to catch on though. A guy that I Skyped with in Denmark, he's really good at it. I was showing him how I rolled up a heroic persona, and we had a lot of discussions. He's really good, and there's another guy that's going to GaryCon this March who's going to run a game, which will be the first person since me. And then there's a guy named Ben that works with Ernest Gary Gygax Jr., who has an interest in it. He hasn't really done anything with it, but he's been looking into it and
right.
stuff. And there's one small little page on Facebook for it.
Right now.
Yeah,
right.
there's like 2 or 3 guys on that.
So there's
active.
To people that
4 or
are
5 maybe.
Like, because I guess it's getting to really be a big thing again.
Well, D&D is not this game, but D&D is.
But for people that understand who Gary Gygax is and the significance of that, they may not know that there is a whole nother game out there that he made. Now he did it outside
actually.
He did it outside of TSR, right?
Yeah.
And it was kind of put out there, and then it was like immediately retracted and got wrapped up in.
Well, it was. After he left from TSR, he was really ousted from TSR.
Right.
Once he left, he started another game company. Well, he didn't start another game company. He started working for GDW to publish this Dangerous Journeys game. Originally, it was called Dangerous Dimensions. I had a few other names before that, but they never caught on, like Hekalord, and there was another one. But
let me ask you this before we get too deep into this. Is this something that you might be able to do another type of podcast on, like, the history of role playing games and sort of the story of how all this stuff? Because it's fascinating. It's not. I don't think it is what a lot of people think it is. Actually, I know it's not. But and I know you have a lot of experience sort of with that subject matter as well.
Certainly books I can point people to as well. That's really good knowledge.
So yeah, definitely the next time we should do something on science, but I would like to get you to talk about that too. I think people might find that fascinating.
Or that OR stuff that's kind of a segue from the psychotropic religion thing.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
So we're at we did pretty good, right? So we're coming up here on like an hour and a half, and I think that's pretty good. I think you've covered the topic you wanted to cover. So that's episode 4 of No Shit. Thanks for listening in, everybody. Thank you, Eric, for coming in and doing
Matt.
this. And so we'll be catching you guys soon. Thanks for joining, and hope you liked it.
Bye.